Testing, testing, testing. Well, welcome back to Regaining the Balance, guys. I'm sorry it's been such a long time since I've done any streams or any videos, but life has taken over. My homestead during the summertime is a lot of work, and same with my gardening job. So it's really difficult to find time to do some videos, but I'm trying to get back into the swing of things, and we're going to try to finish this book. I had a few people give me some messages telling me that they'd love for me to finish it, and so here we go. We're going to just read the end of this particular section real quick, and then I will come back after I finish this and eat a little something, and we'll do the next section, which will be a much longer video. So, without further ado, let us get to that part. There we go. Right, and I will not be in the chat. So, let us get to this book here. I'm going to start off exactly where I left off on the last video, and once I'm done with this, I'll try and see if I can do a link up from the very beginning of this section of this chapter, so in case you guys want to go back and re-listen, and then, but either way, I think the sound is good, everything's working good, and we shall get on these, 8 pages or something like that. So we'll be here for a little bit, not too long, and then I'll come back for a much longer block afterwards. So, the sword, as the proper instrument of sacrifice, occurs again in the old treatise entitled Concilium Conigui Massa Solis et Lunae. This says both must be killed with their own sword, both referring to Sol and Luna. In the still older Tractus Micerius, dating perhaps from the 12th century, we find the, quote, fiery sword, unquote, in a quotation from Ostanes. Quote, the great Astenus, Ostanes, said, take an egg, pierce it with the fiery sword, and separate its soul from its body, unquote. Here the sword is something that divides body and soul, corresponding to the division between heaven and earth. The ring of fire, hold on a second here, let's just double check. Here the sword is something that divides the body and soul, corresponding to the division between heaven and earth, the ring of fire and paradise, or paradise and the first parents. In an equally old treatise, the, quote, Allegoria Sapientum Supra Librum Turbe, unquote, there is even mention of a sacrificial rite, quote, take a fowl, volatile, cut off its head with the fiery sword, then pluck out its feathers, separate the limbs, and cook over a charcoal fire until it becomes of one color, unquote. Here we have a decapitation with the fiery sword, then a, quote, clipping, unquote, or more accurately, a plucking, and usually a, quote, cooking, unquote. The cock, which is probably what is meant here, is simply called volatile, a foul or winged creature, and this is a common term for spirit, but a spirit still nature-bound and imperfect and in need of improvement. In another old treatise with a very similar title, Allegoria Super Librum Turbe, we find the following supplementary variants. Quote, kill the mother, the prima materia, tearing off her hands and feet. Quote, take a viper and cut off its head and tail. And, quote, take a cock and pluck it alive. Unquote. Sounds terrible. Take a man, shave him, and drag him over the stone, i.e. dry him on the hot stone till the body dies. Unquote. Take the glass vessel containing bridegroom and bride, and throw them into the furnace and roast them for 3 days, and they will be 2 in one flesh. Take the white man from the vessel, unquote. Okay, this one is probably right in assuming that these recipes are instructions for magical sacrifices, not unlike the Greek magic papyri. In an example of the latter, I will give the recipe from the Memot papyrus quote, take a tomcat and make an Osiris of him by immersing his body in water, and then you proceed to suffocate him, talk into his back, unquote. Another example of the same papyri, quote, take a hoopoe, tear out its heart, pierce it with a reed, then cut it up and throw it into the Attic honey, unquote. Such sacrifices really were made for the purpose of summoning up the Peredros, the familiar spirit. That this sort of thing was practiced, or at least any rate recommended by the alchemists, is clear from the, quote, Liber Platonis Quartorum, unquote, where it speaks of the, quote, oblationis e sacrificia, unquote, offered to the planetary demon. A deeper and more somber note is struck in the following passage, which I give in the original and generally very corrupt text, which, okay, yeah, he at least puts a translation on it. One thing I will say, though, when they talk about demons, and I've mentioned this on countless occasions, it's not the same meaning as what people think of demons today, just so you understand. Like demons or daemons, which would have included an A here, would have been like an elemental spirit of sorts, which is in almost every one of these ancient religions. A lot of these gods are elemental spirits. So continuing, the translation from this: the vessel must be round in shape, thus the artifex must be the transformer of this firmament and of the brain pan, just as the thing for which we seek is as a simple thing having uniform parts. It is therefore necessary that you should generate it in a body, i.e. a vessel, of uniform parts, from the brain pan, that is, from the head of the elements man, and that the whole should be macerated with urine. One asks oneself how literally this recipe is to be taken. The following story from the Gaia al-Hakim is exceedingly enlightening in this connection. The Jacobite patriarch Dionysius, I set it on record that in the year 765, a man who was destined for the sacrifice, on beholding the bloody head of his predecessor, was so terrified that he took flight and lodged a complaint with Abbas, the prefect of Mesopotamia, against the priest of Haran, who were afterwards severely punished. The story goes on to say that in 830, the Caliph Mamun told the Harianite envoys, quote, you were without doubt the people of the head who were dealt with by my father, Rashid, unquote. We learn from the Gaia that a fair-haired man with dark blue eyes was lured into a chamber of the temple where he was immersed in a great jar filled with sesame oil. Only his head was left sticking out. There he remained for 40 days, and during this time he was fed on nothing but figs soaked in sesame oil. He was not given a drop of water to drink. As a result of this treatment, his body became soft as wax. The prisoner then was repeatedly fumigated with incense, and magical formulae were pronounced over him. Eventually, his head was torn off at the neck, and the body remained in the oil. Wow. The head was then placed in a niche on the ashes of burnt olives and was packed around with cotton wool. More incense was burned before it, and the head would thereupon predict famines or good harvests, changes of dynasty, and other future events. Its eyes could see, though the lids did not move. It also revealed to people their inmost thoughts, and scientific and technical questions were likewise addressed to it. Sounds like some straight-up black magic. Even though it was possible that the real head was in later times replaced by a dummy, the whole idea of this ceremony, particularly when taken in conjunction with the above passage from the Liber Quartorum, seems to point to an original human sacrifice. The idea of a mysterious head is, however, considerably older than the school of Haran. As far back as Zosimos, we find the philosophers described as, quote, children of the golden head, unquote, and we also encounter the, quote, round element, unquote, which Zosimos says is the later omega. Interesting. This symbol may well be interpreted as the head, since the Liber Quartorum also associates the round vessel with the head. Zosimos, moreover, refers on several occasions to the white, quote, whitest stone which is in the head, unquote. Probably all these ideas go back to the severed head of Osiris, which crossed the sea and was therefore associated with the idea of resurrection. The head quote, head of Osiris, unquote, also plays an important part in medieval alchemy. In this connection, we might mention the legend that was current about the Gerber of Reims, but the current about Gerber of Reims. Afterwards, Pope Sylvester II, at AD 1003, he was believed to have possessed a golden head which spoke to him in oracles. Gabel was one of the greatest savants of his time and well known as a transmitter of Arabic science. Can it be that the translation of the Liber Quartorum, which is of Hellenic origin, goes back to this author? Unfortunately, there is little prospect of our being able to prove this. What's interesting, actually, guys, is that in Blavatsky's second book of, what's it called? Isis Unveiled, she actually recounts an entire scene just like this, but it's one of the, I think it's one of the head Medicis who does this. So maybe at some point we'll cover that. But there's a pretty, it's the description of this is exactly the same in the other book, which is pretty wild. All right. So, anyways, continuing. It has been conjectured that the Hieronyte oracle head may be connected with the ancient Hebrew teraphim. Rabbinic tradition considers the teraphim to have been originally either the decapitated head or skull of a human being, or else a dummy head. The Jews had teraphim about the house as a sort of lairs and penates, who were plural spirits like the Kibiri. The idea that they were heads goes back to 1 Samuel 19, verse 19 and 13, which describes how Michal, David's wife, put the teraphim in David's bed in order to deceive the messengers of Saul who wanted to kill him. Quote, then Michal took a image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with the clothes, RSV, unquote. The, quote, pillow of goat's hair, unquote, is linguistically obscure and has even been interpreted as meaning that the teraphim were goats, but it may also mean something woven or plaited out of goat's hair, like a wig, and this would fit in better with the picture of a man lying in bed. Further evidence for this comes from the legend in a collection of midrashim from the 12th century, printed in Ben Gurion's Die Segen der Juden, where it is said, the teraphim were idols. They were made in the following way. The head of a man who had to be firstborn was cut off and hair plucked out. The head was then sprinkled with salt and anointed with oil. Afterwards, a little plaque of copper or gold was inscribed with the name of an idol and placed under the tongue of the decapitated head. The head was set up in a room. Candles were lit before it, and the people made obeisance. And if any man fell down before it, the head began to speak and answered all questions that were addressed to it. This is an obvious parallel to the Hieronytic ritual with the head. The tearing out of the hair seems significant since it is an equivalent of scalping or shearing and is thus a rebirth mystery. It is conceivable that in later times the bald skull was covered with a wig for a rite of renewal, as is also reported from Egypt. Makes you wonder about all these parliamentary guys with their big wigs and where that came from. Anyways, continuing. It seems probable that this magical procedure is of primitive origin. I am indebted to the South African writer Lorenz van der Post for the following report from a lecture which he gave in Zurich in 1951. Quoting, the tribe in question was an offshoot of the great Swazi nation, a Bantu people. When some years ago the old chief died, he was succeeded by his son, a young man of weak character. He soon proved to be so unsatisfactory a chief that his uncles called a meeting of the tribal elders. They decided that something must be done to strengthen their chief, so they consulted the witch doctors. The witch doctor treated him with a medicine which proved ineffective. Another meeting was held, and the witch doctors were asked to use the strongest medicine of all on the chief because the situation had become desperate. Excuse me, I need to take a quick drink. Excuse me. A half-brother of the chief, a boy of 12, was chosen to provide the material for the medicine. One afternoon, a sorcerer went up to the boy who was tending cattle and engaged him in conversation. Then, emptying some powder from a horn into his hand, he took a reed and he blew the powder into the ears and nostrils of the boy. Witness told me that the lad thereupon began to sway like a drunken person and sank to the ground shivering. He was then taken to the riverbed, tied to the roots of a tree. More powder was sprinkled round about the sorcerer, saying, quote, this person will no longer eat food, but only earth and roots, unquote. The boy was kept in the riverbed for 9 months. Some people say a cage was made and put into the stream, which the boy inside it, for hours on end, so that the water should flow over him and make his skin white. Whoa. Others reported seeing him crawling about in the riverbed on his hands and knees, but all were so frightened that although there was a mission school only 100 yards away, no one except those directly concerned in the ritual would go near him. All agreed that at the end of 9 months, this fat, normal, healthy boy was like an animal and quite white-skinned. One woman said his eyes were white and the whole of his body was white as paper. On the evening that the boy was to be killed, a veteran witch doctor was summoned to the chief's kraal and asked to consult the tribal spirits. This he did in the cattle kraal, and after selecting an animal for slaughter, he returned to the chief's hut. There the witch doctor was handing parts of the dead boy's body, at first the head and the sack, then a thumb and a toe, and cut off the nose and ears and lips, mixed them with medicine, and cooked them over a fire in a broken clay pot. He stuck 2 spears on either side of the pot. Then those present, 12 in all, including the weak chief, leaned over the pot and deeply inhaled the steam. All save the boy's mother dipped their fingers in the pot and licked them. He inhaled but refused to dip her fingers in the pot. The rest of the body, the witch doctor mixed into a kind of bread for doctoring the tribe's crops. Wow. Oh my God. Oh, can you imagine that? Oh, jeez. And this is from 1951. This guy gave a lecture, so that was within a decent time period of that. I mean, some of the stuff people do in these corners of the world is just unbelievable. Anyways, continuing. Although this magical rite is not actually a, quote, head mystery, unquote, it has several things in common with the practices previously mentioned. The body is macerated and transformed by long immersion in water. The victim is killed. The salient portions of the head from the main ingredient of the, quote, strengthening, quote, unquote, medicine which was concocted for the chief and his immediate circle, the body is kneaded into a sort of bread, and this is obviously thought of as a strengthening medicine for the tribe's crops as well. The rite is a transformation process, a sort of rebirth after 9 months of incubation in the water. Lawrence Vanderpost thinks that the purpose of the whitening was to assimilate the mana of the white man who has the political power. I agree with this view and would add that painting with white clay often signifies transformation into ancestral spirits in the same way as the neophytes are made invisible in the Nandi territory in Kenya, where they walk about in portable cone-shaped grass huts and demonstrate their invisibility to everyone. Skull worship is widespread among primitives in Melanesia and Polynesia. It is chiefly the skulls of the ancestors that are worshipped because they establish connections with the spirits, or serve as tutelary deities like the head of Osiris in Egypt. Skulls also play a considerable role as sacrificed relics. It would lead us too far to go into this primitive skull worship, so I must refer the reader to the literature. And I guess he's got a footnote here. So the literature is by O'Nien's The Origin of European Thought. Interesting. Or no, I'm sorry, Hastings, Volume 4. Where am I at now? I would only like to point out that the cut-off ears, nose, and mouth can represent the head as parts that stand for the whole. There are numerous examples for this. Equally, the head or its parts, brain, etc., can act as magical food or as a means for increasing the fertility of the land. It is of special significance for the alchemical tradition that the oracle head, also known in Greece, Alien, whoa, interesting. Alien reports that Cleomenes of Sparta had the head of his friend Archonides preserved in a jar of honey and that he consulted it as an oracle. The same was said of the head of Orpheus. Onions rightly emphasizes the fact that the Greek word here, whose seat was in the head, corresponds to the modern unconscious, quote unquote, and what at the stage of development consciousness was identified with breath and lungs and was localized in the chest or heart region. Hence Pindar's expression for the soul, image of Ion, is extraordinarily apt, for the collective conscious does not only imparts oracles, but forever represents the microcosm, i.e., the form of physical man mirroring the cosmos. Now this is fascinating. This is like as horrifying as this is, this whole identification with the breath and the lungs and the heart region is going to be a major theme in so much of what I hopefully will have some time to put together for you guys. Even with the way that the entire, like all these Gothic churches and these old churches, very old churches in Europe, the way that they're built, the architecture, everything has a lot to do with what we just read here. And interestingly enough, I mean, what do you do in the church, right? You're taking part into the sacrifice of, blood, or the Eucharist and all that kind of stuff. There's the blood and the bread, which is fascinating because this has very similar connotations here, which I'm assuming is why he really threw this into this lecture. So continuing, there's no evidence to show that any of the parallels we have drawn are historically connected with the Zosimos visions. It seems rather to be a case partly of parallel traditions, transmitted perhaps chiefly through the Heron school, and partly of spontaneous fantasies arising from the same archetypal background from which the traditions were derived in the first place. As my examples have shown, the imagery of the Zosimos visions, however strange it may be, is by no means isolated, but it is interwoven with older ideas, some of which were certainly and others quite possibly known to Zosimos, as well as with parallels of uncertain date which continue to mold the speculations of the alchemists for many centuries to come. Religious thought in the early Christian era was not completely cut off from all contact with these conceptions. It was in fact influenced by them, and in turn it fertilized the minds of the natural philosophers during later centuries. Towards the end of the 16th century, the Alchemical Opus was even represented in the form of a mass. The author of this tour de force was the Hungarian alchemist Melchior Gibbonisis. I have elaborated this parallel in my book, Psychology and Alchemy, which I guess I'm going to have to put that one on the list. I definitely have it out downloaded, so we'll get to that at some point. In the visions of Zosimos, the Heros, who is transformed into Pneuma, represents the transformative principle at work in nature and the harmony of opposing forces. And this is very much similar to the way it's represented in the Shiva Sakti type of idea as well. So continuing, Chinese philosophy formulated this process as the enantiodromane interplay of yin and yang. Exactly. But the curious personifications and symbols characteristic not only of these visions, but of alchemical literature in general, show in the plainest possible terms that we are dealing with the psychic process that takes place mainly in the unconscious, and therefore can come into consciousness only in the form of a dream or vision. At that time, and until very much later, no one had any idea of the unconscious. Subsequently, all unconscious content were projected into the object, or rather, were found in nature as apparent objects or properties of matter, and were not recognized as purely internal psychic events. There is some evidence that Zosimos was well aware of the spiritual or mystical side of this art, but he believed that what he was concerned with was a spirit that dwelt in natural objects, and not something that came from the human psyche. It remained for modern science to despiritualize nature through its so-called objective knowledge of matter. All anthropomorphic projections were withdrawn from the object one after another, with a twofold result. Firstly, man's mystical identity with nature was curtailed as never before, which I'd like to point out is an extremely important point. And secondly, the projections falling back into the human soul caused such a terrific activation of the unconscious that in modern times man was compelled to postulate the existence of an unconscious psyche. The first beginnings of this can be seen in Leibniz and Kant, and then with mounting intensity in Schelling, Carus, and von Hartmann, until finally modern psychology discarded the last metaphysical claims of the philosopher-psychologist and restricted the idea of the psyche's existence to the psychological statement, in other words, to its phenomenology. So far as the dramatic course of the Mass represents the death, sacrifice, and resurrection of a god and the inclusion and active participation of the priest and congregation, its phenomenology may legitimately be brought into line with other fundamentally similar, though more primitive religious customs. This always involves the risk that sensitive people will find it unpleasant when, quote, all small things are compared with great, unquote. In fairness to the primitive psyche, however, I would like to emphasize that the holy dread, quote-unquote, of civilized man differs but little from the awe of the primitive, and that the God who is present and active in the mystery is a mystery for both. No matter how crass the outward differences, the similarities or equivalence of meaning should not be overlooked. All right. So, with that, the next section will be the psychology of the mass, section 4, which I think is it wraps up this whole larger part of let's see here, what's it called? Transformation, symbolism, in the mass. So it's almost lunch here, and then I'll probably have about 2 hours to spend with you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip off. I'm going to eat something real quick, and let's see here. I'll eat something real quick, and then I will be back to basically do, well, I'm going to attempt my best at trying to do this next section. I think it's something like, I'm not even sure. Let's see here. I think it's something like, yeah, we'll see. It's a little over 50 pages. So, and it's pretty dense stuff. So we'll see where I can get to it. But I would like to get to it because I'd like to at least finish off this part of the book. And then, like I said before, I'm going to attempt at really getting back to doing this with you guys. Maybe not on a daily basis, even though that would be nice. But I'm going to try to get back into this because I just have a mountain of stuff that's just piling up. And if I don't get to it, I don't know if I ever will get to it. So thanks a lot for joining me for this little short finishing stream. And those of you that have been waiting for this, hopefully you are happy that I'm finally getting around to it. So I will be back in about 15, 20, 30 minutes, something like that, with this next section. So peace, and I will see you guys soon.